So when we ask ourselves a question about what genre is the story of Jonah in, there are some possible explanations. Could it be a heroic narrative of this heroic prophet going through this incredible journey of the whale or the fish and saving a city? That is typically how many have been presented with the story when they first heard it. Could it be a morality tale or a parable where Jonah at first is reluctant to follow his call to God and eventually comes around to do what God asks him to do? Is it a poetic tragedy? Certainly chapter 2 in Jonah is well known as Hebrew poetry, but is that really enough to classify Jonah as a book of poetry or poetic tragedy? Or could it be, as I'm going to talk about today, a parody in narrative form? And just so you don't think I'm just coming up with this, this isn't a new, though it may be a seldom heard idea. In fact, a well-known commentator on the book of Jonah, Dr. Kevin Youngblood, has written in his commentary, Jonah, God's Scandalous Mercy. Thus, Jonah may be characterized as a gentle parody of the traditional prophetic account designed to challenge Judah's distorted notions of traditional prophetic themes, such as divine justice and Israel's election. If so, then, we best understand what exactly is a parody. According to the dictionary definition, a parody is a form of satire whose form is literary. In other words, a literary satire. Well, satire is when one makes fun of standard behavior, normal, expected behavior. If it's made fun of, then it is satire. Now, I know many of us are probably familiar with satire in our modern world. For instance, on the web, you can find a satire site called Babylon Bee, very well known and generally points fun at news of the day, current events that come up, and it pokes fun at that, putting them in different lights so that we can perhaps see how ridiculous some of our current events are. It's not always funny, but it's poking fun at or taking something that the audience doesn't expect and putting it together with other elements and kind of making the audience scratch their head and say, wow, that's not what I expected. And in a sense, when we read Jonah, we're getting a good example of some very, very ancient parody. One of the tasks that an author must do if their hope is to create an effective parody is to set the stage, and especially setting the stage with stereotypes. For instance, in a fairy tale, we have some well-known stereotypes. There's the princess who inevitably needs saving. There's the prince who will come to the rescue. The reader approaching a fairy tale kind of expects that these stereotypes have been put in place ahead of time so that they get a good background setting for the action to come. And our parody in Jonah is very similar. So what are some of the stereotypical characters that one might expect in a parody of a prophet like Jonah? Well, you have the prophet, right? We have to have that main character. Then we have the God who summons the prophet to call to duty, if you will. Well, then we have somebody who's going to be receiving the judgment, the king and their wicked city. So those stereotypes, those stereotypical characters are generally put in place ahead of time. And then we have the actions of those characters, which are also going to be stereotypical. We're going to have the prophet's initial reluctance to take on the task. And not picking on Jonah here, we have other prophets, as we'll see in a moment, who also were initially reluctant to respond to their calling, like Moses and Isaiah. And so that trope is in the story. The prediction of destruction, of course, whether that be Sodom and Gomorrah, whether that be Nineveh, we have this idea, this stereotype of the destruction of an entire city. And then we'll also have the grief at failure to be able to save the city. We think of perhaps Abraham, for instance, and his wheeling and dealing with God in order to be able to save the city. If there were only a few righteous men there, or Jeremiah's failure to be able to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem. And so those themes are repeated in the Bible. But let's take a look then and see how Jonah takes some of those themes and turns them upside down. Now, there are many layers within Jonah. I would like to bring to our attention just 5 distinct areas that we can look at Jonah in and see something like parody going on. The first, I already briefly mentioned, that's the prophet's call to prophecy, the call to mission. We see that happen with Moses in Exodus 4, Gideon in Judges, Isaiah in Isaiah 6, and Jeremiah right from the beginning in Jeremiah 1. These prophets were called to duty, and they realized their lack of either being equipped. They made excuses. Moses said he was a stutterer. Isaiah said he was a man of unclean lips, not worthy to serve. This is the normal, expected response many times for prophets. But in the Hebrew way of thinking, that response, that reluctance is perfectly natural. They're human. God is calling them to a big task. So that's normal. What isn't normal is what Jonah does. Jonah does not put forth his objections to serving. He actually says nothing at all. He just runs. He runs to the opposite direction of where God is calling him to go. And so this silence of Jonah's actually speaks volumes. I'll give you an example. So we know that in a wedding ceremony, there are certain, again, stereotypes, right? Or at least expected characters. There's a bride, there's a groom, there's the audience. So we know when we're in a wedding because we look around and we can see that the expected people and events are taking place, right? But what happens when the officiator of the wedding, let's say the pastor, asks the groom, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" And there's nothing but silence. The audience might think, well, that's awkward because that question really demands an answer, doesn't it? It's not that different from the Hebrew reader knowing the way that God calls prophets to their calling, to their commission, to their duty. They say something. They don't just run. And so we can see how the author is giving Jonah this very non-standard and, in a sense, exhibiting parody in the way his response is, to run and say nothing at all. And if you've read Jonah, you realize the futility in his running, right? Is he really trying to outrun God? Like, you can't do that, right? And so we see a bit of, we feel as we're reading about Jonah's flight and we see the futility of it and the foolishness of it, we're starting to feel some of the parody that the author is intentionally putting in there for us. Another area of the Jonah story that seems to be delivered in a parody sort of sense is the interaction with other gods. Many times in prophetic literature, when we read about how God's prophets interact with other prophets or other gods, it's in a battle sort of way. When we think of Moses battling Pharaoh, or in the sense Moses' God battling the gods of Egypt, that kind of thing is very familiar to us reading the Bible. Elijah and Baal, or the priests of Baal, is another example where Elijah sets down the challenge and the priests of Baal try to get their God to show up for battle. And I think, as I recall, Elijah accuses them of their God, Baal, of being indisposed in the restroom somewhere. What mockery, right? But it's in a battle sense. So many times we see that kind of picturing of God versus the pagan gods, but not in Jonah. In Jonah, we do see that the pagan sailors are encouraged to pray to their gods for help. But as soon as they figure out that it's Jonah who boldly states that he is a Hebrew who fears Yahweh, which of course we know to be not a sincere statement just by the fact that he's running. He's not really fearing God at all. But they immediately start to pray to Yahweh for help and deliverance from the storm. There's no battle there. It's immediate concession that God is the real God, the living God, the God who made, in Jonah's words, the heavens and the earth. So that's a bit upside down from what we're used to seeing. Jonah here is really portrayed as an inferior prophet, and it's the pagans, the faithful pagans, who are doing the right thing by trying to discern the living God's will and how to appease his anger that's been demonstrated through the storm. The third scene that seems to be full of different elements of irony and parody and things that the reader should consider to not be quite right, not be expected, is the second chapter of Jonah. It's well known that that second chapter is actually in poetic form. And whether it's part of the original writing of Jonah or whether it was added later is a debate that scholars are still tossing around today with no definitive answer. But whether or not it is originally a part of Jonah, it certainly does seem to also contribute to the idea of the parody of Jonah. It is a psalm of rescue or a psalm of thanksgiving. When you read through the words of Jonah chapter 2, you can't help but think this is praise. This is a psalm of rescue or thanksgiving, and yet it's delivered from the dire peril in the belly of a fish. Doesn't sound like much of a rescue on the surface, does it? Now, Psalm 130 happens to use a very similar phrasing as it opens, from the depths I cry to you, O Lord. That sounds very much like something Jonah would say. But in Jonah, it's really an actual depths, right? If we're to take the story to be the recollection of what Jonah really experienced, this is not figurative. This is actual dire straits from the belly of the fish. And so it's not a figurative depths that Jonah is calling from. One commentator said that it was a hollow song from a hollow place, that the song didn't really fit the setting. And so if we consider the appropriateness, for instance, of figurative versus literal language, perhaps you've heard a news report or something, read an article that described, let's say, a crime wave in America is like a cancer eating away at the bowels of America, something like that. That's very figurative, right? Obviously, crime isn't really cancer, but you see the figurative, metaphorical association there. Yet, when we actually talk about cancer, you wouldn't say that this cancer is eating away at the bowels of somebody who's suffering from it, right? That would be too real. That would be really relating directly to the situation they're in. So there's a place for figurative language, but not when you're actually in that place. And that's what really lends to the sense of parody here, is the inappropriateness between what Jonah is supposedly praising God for and the situation that he's in, which is not exactly, he hasn't been rescued necessarily from his danger. In fact, John Miles of Loyola University wrote a great article on this called Laughing at the Bible. And his quote is, Jonah's situation is not comparable to the situation of a man swallowed by a great monster. This is Jonah's situation. His troubles are not like waves washing over his head. His troubles are waves washing over his head, unquote. So you can see how the discord between the figurative and the actual seems to just lend itself to thinking this probably isn't as serious as it may appear on first read. The fourth reason that perhaps we should be reading this as parody as well is also related to the poetry section, and that is that the poetry just seems to be over the top when it comes to the watery verses of chapter 2. There's so much water and descriptions of water and seaweed and water over my head and rivers of currents going through the water that it's almost as if you were reading a poem that just gets stuck on one theme, like a needle on a record player gets stuck and just plays the same music over and over again. Now, that's not to say that necessarily this might have been intentional by the author of the poetry, but one of our weaknesses in studying Hebrew poetry is that we really don't know what bad Hebrew poetry is. We have what we have, but it's hard to tell whether we're reading a masterpiece of Hebrew poetry or whether we're reading Class B or Class C Hebrew poetry. It's not readily documented what the original readers would have said, that's awesome poetry, and other ones would have said with a groan, oh man, you're killing me here. So we read this as poetry, but it's a little bit over the top perhaps with all that water and everything associated with water, which may lend us to believe that this is perhaps another element of parody in Jonah. And finally, the fifth area I'd like to discuss is that of the expected norm of the Old Testament prophet being rejected by the king or by the city or by the people. We see this over and over again. For instance, with Moses in the Exodus, he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I don't think so. And go through all the plagues and everything before Pharaoh finally relents. We look at 1 Kings and we see this story of Micaiah and Ahab, and Micaiah is actually imprisoned by Ahab. He has given his prophecy to King Ahab. Ahab doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Isaiah and Manasseh is another example. And the prophet Jeremiah and King Zedekiah. Despite all that Jeremiah has warned Zedekiah about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the coming destruction of the temple, Zedekiah will not change his ways, and he will continue to attack the forces of Nebuchadnezzar and just does not listen to the prophet. So this idea of the rejected prophet by those in authority or those in the people is the norm. It's the standard. It's what the reader would expect to see. But not Jonah. In fact, his interactions with the king are never actually one-on-one like the other prophets were. The king of Nineveh gets his information secondhand from the people. So that already says something about Jonah and his role as the typical prophet. And we can even consider the message of Jonah as something that perhaps is parodied by the author when compared to the well-known messages of other biblical prophets. Such that, for instance, there's no eloquent speech of passion. There's no listing of the crimes committed by the king, the people, the kingdom. There's no description of the horror of the judgment that God is going to bring to the city of Nineveh. There's no imperative to repent, to turn. In fact, Jonah just utters a single short sentence about how many days it's going to be before Nineveh is overthrown. That's it. It's the only record we have. Now, that short prophetic message, missing these key elements that other long, eloquent, prophetic warnings all include, should cue us as to what's going on with Jonah and what is the author's intention here regarding Jonah's message to the people. And as I previously stated, the result of this very short and discreet message is exactly the opposite of what the other prophets have experienced in the Bible. not rejection, not grandiose battles like Elijah and Baal, but we get this bizarre response of the entire city just immediately believes this very short, terse message. Over 120,000 people immediately repents. They immediately go tell the king, and the king issues an edict for them to don sackcloth, to take a mourning attitude, a repentant attitude, and not just the people, but the animals too. And just the inclusion of the animals to fast and to repent seems on its face quite silly. Not that it's unheard of in ancient Near Eastern literature. There are some examples of the animals also being requested to be a part of repenting, but it's rare, and the author here might even be alluding to those other examples. Those are outside of the Bible, to kind of reinforce to the reader just the silliness of this whole thing. So even if, as we appreciate the 120,000 people who've repented and avoided destruction, this should now, again in the sense of being over the top, this should now and does make Jonah the most successful Old Testament prophet ever. He saved an entire city. He's caused an entire city to respond to the message of God. 120,000 souls have been saved, plus the animals. That's an incredible success story. And yet, again, over the top, we find that Jonah is upset and not happy with being the most successful prophet ever, and is instead all upset over the death of a single plant. And as we finish the book of Jonah, then, we're left with a sense of irony. There is not a wrap-up of, and they lived happily ever after. There is this, you almost feel like there's a portion of the book that got lost at the end. This is the way to end Jonah? Yes, it is. It may feel uncomfortable when you read it, but it's because perhaps we're not fully appreciating that this is exactly the way a parody should end. So now this is the way this video should end, I'm sure. Do you agree with me? Do you think that Jonah is a parody, or perhaps myself and others are just reading too much into this and not taking it at the plain face value that it should be taken as this great story of a prophet who ran away but came back and was redeemed? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. And if you really enjoy this kind of content that we enjoy providing for you at Biblical Mastery Academy, would you please click the like button below and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see more videos like this? If you would also be interested in reading Jonah in Hebrew, which a lot of this comes out only in Hebrew. If you've only ever read Jonah in English, a lot of this may not jump right out at you. You may think I'm just pulling this out of thin air. But it's in the Hebrew. These nuances are there. If you'd like to learn Hebrew, you can also do that. Get more information from Biblical Mastery Academy to do that by going to the URL bma.to/starterpack. And we have a good introduction package for you if that's something you'd like to pursue, so that you can get to know your Hebrew Bible better, and therefore get to know your whole Bible better. And the closer we all get to the Word of God, then the closer we'll get to God, and we'll know His will and be able to serve Him better. And I encourage you to do so today. So until I get a chance to see you again, shalom.